All right, welcome everyone to So Much Together, Bridging the Gaps, the Future of the Intergenerational Climate Movement with Adah Crandall and Danny Cage. I'm Roselle Medina. I manage programs here at Oregon Humanities. I'll be sort of facilitating the flow of the workshop, which we're honored to have Adah and Danny here presenting their work and their ideas and leading some conversation and discussion and reflection. Like I said, my name is Roselle Medina. I manage programs at Oregon Humanities. Our mission is to connect people and communities through conversation, storytelling, and participatory programs to inspire understanding and collaborative change. So Much Together is a program of Oregon Humanities that celebrates the abundance of imaginative and collaborative work shaping lives and the land in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. So let me introduce Adah and Danny. I'm really honored to have Adah and Danny here today. I've had the opportunity to collaborate some with Adah in the past, and have been able to meet Danny on a number of occasions, and their work comes directly to mind when I think about the imaginative and collaborative work shaping lives on the land in the Pacific Northwest. Adah is an organizer with Sunrise Movement, PDX's Youth versus ODOT campaign, and the co-lead of Portland Youth Climate Strike, among many other things. Danny Cage is a speaker and youth organizer advocating for racial justice, educational reform, and LGBTQ+ rights, starting his activism at an early age by attending protests and rallies. His goal is to build political engagement within the Portland metropolitan area and across Oregon. You'll have a chance to learn much more about Adah and Danny as we move forward. And so without taking up any more time, I'll hand things over to Adah and Danny. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Just to check, can folks see my whole screen? Or is it blocked by the part of the Zoom bar? Yeah, okay, sweet. Yeah, all right, so we're just gonna do like some quick, more in-depth introductions. As Roselle mentioned, my name is Adah Crandall. I'm an organizer with Portland Youth Climate Strike and Sunrise PDX. I'm also a senior at Grant High School in Northeast Portland. And yeah, I got involved in organizing when I was in 7th grade at Tubman Middle School. My classmates and I started learning a lot about the air pollution from the nearby freeway, and that really radicalized me in a lot of ways and helped me to understand, yeah, the power that youth have to take action, and also the many ways in which our systems and our government are not set up to give us the features that we deserve. And that's really been a driving force in my organizing over the last few years. Danny, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Danny Cage. I'm also an organizer with Sunrise Movement. I go to Grant as well. I work in the Oregon Capitol, and if you look at my background, that's what you'll see is I'm currently sitting in the lobby. And I also serve on the Oregon Environmental Justice Council, appointed by Governor Brown last year. And so I advise on environmental justice issues within the state.
Sweet. Okay. Yeah, and I will pass it over to Danny to ground us in what it's like to be a young person organizing these days.
Yeah, so this is a collage that we have created, and it's for me, this is like extremely relatable. I think I also imagine Adah extremely agrees to this as well. But I mean, I'll just go through the images, but the middle image is I want to say 2021 or 2022. I want to say 2022 climate strike hosted by Sunrise Movement and Portland Youth Climate Strike, PYCS. And the photo on the side as well as photos from the climate event. Slack, which is an app used often by organizers, and we also here at the Oregon Legislature, in my office at least, we use a Slack as well. That one where it has like 8,000 email messages, mine's actually 10,000 unopened, so I feel feel like I'm beating that. But all to say, it can be very chaotic and a lot going on managing and handling while you're also in high school with adult like responsibilities.
Yeah, something we really want to emphasize is that young people cannot be fighting the climate crisis by ourselves. And a lot of the time, older people will see these youth activists and think like, wow, they're so inspiring. Like we're told that we're inspiring a lot, but we really need adults to do more than sort of kind words. And yeah, we want to emphasize that like everyone has something to offer to this movement. And the only way that we're going to stop the climate crisis is uniting across generations, across age. Youth really bring a lot of valuable perspective and urgency and this really radical ability to envision the world that we're fighting for. Something I think about a lot is how youth are often less bound by this sort of status quo narrative of what is considered politically possible. I think we're a lot more able to see with clarity the way that the world doesn't have to be the way that it's always been, and that we can really change these systems to work better for our communities. And then on the other side of that, adults also offer, in a lot of cases, a lot of the sort of more technical policy knowledge, also connections either to, organizations or groups that can help organize, or connections just to other adults. Like adults have access to coworkers and, other older people that young people often can't access that well. And so when we build this movement across generations, it exponentially increases the amount of people that we're able to reach and the amount of people that we're able to bring into this. Yeah. Any questions on anything that we've covered so far? Feel free to drop things in the chat throughout as well.
And I think also, just to add on to the slideshow, was really important is noticing that there are both sides, because such a key emphasis on intergenerational and the need that everyone offer something to movement, and really understanding movement building means that everyone plays a key part in doing that work.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to dive into some case studies of times that young people and adults came together to win really big victories in the climate movement. And throughout this, I want to encourage y'all to be thinking about the prompts on the Jamboard. So like, what are the what are the barriers to youth and adults working together, and what are some of the benefits, and trying to pull things from these examples so that we can discuss afterwards. Danny.
Yeah, so for some background information, Portland Public Schools passed the Climate Crisis Response Policy, also keyed as CCRP because it's way too long. But the policy covers both infrastructure-wise, so that means like net zero goals, carbon emission goals, covers increasing our access to places, sustainability habits, but also focuses on why it's such an expansive policy is it also focuses on education and climate curriculum as well. And even Sierra Club called it a landmark policy. And so last year, Adah, part of Sunrise Movement, and when I was on the policy committee for Portland Public Schools, we worked closely with both students and our teachers as well. And something that's really important to know is that while this policy had moved about within the committee, And within our communities, it was really students who continue to push it. And again, I think going back to the slide on energy, right? Young people and our students moved the policy, and our adults were really able to act as crafters and shepherds within it. And had that not really had come together, we wouldn't had ended up with such an amazing policy, which allows us to implement it across the state. And now we have an example that yes, landmark policies can be implemented in Oregon for climate education.
Do you want to talk more specifically about, the challenges?
Yes. So, well, we had one major success is the policy and the fact that it's a landmark policy. We have the gave youth autonomy on education. Young people are not always included in the decision-making process in education. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a school board meeting, but it's typically older folks there. And it was really amazing as someone who works around education to see a space that is typically really one-sided on demographics and have had a real range of people. And that type of energized energy around education was really was an opportunity to watch and observe. We also had the fact that it is the policy in itself and being a landmark policy not only sets PPS up for being a leader in sustainability, but following that, schools like Beaverton School District have began to work on similar policies as well. The policy also received an award from the National School Board Association. And I did a presentation with the Oregon School Board Association on how similar school districts can implement this in their district. And it was really awesome to observe that both metropolitan and rural districts were looking into climate sustainability practices following PPS's efforts. And then also challenges. It took over 2 years within that collaboration process, and that didn't even begin to discuss the years prior that it took to really formulate a policy that both the community and staff could work with. We gained support of adults and teachers on why the policy is so important. The conversations around why our education in Portland Association of Teachers and broader educators within our building. And so really having to have those conversations with them on why something like climate justice and education was really important to them. And then also many adults making space in policy making spaces, including education, typically don't work with young people. And so this was actually one of the most ironic things I found within education policies, the amount of older folks who don't work with students and young people. And so getting to hone in on that experience was really interesting and something new that we had the opportunity to do within our district.
We have a question in the chat. Is there designated funding for the PPS climate crisis response policy?
The directive, not necessarily, no. Our climate justice and sustainability chief of staff works closely with the budgeting process. And so there's not necessarily designated money set aside, but it's more of a collaborative effort when we're budgeting.
And then Kathy's also wondering, what does the policy cover?
Yes, I will drop it in the chat in a bit, but the policy covers expanding student engagement around climate education. It sets us to have reduce our emission goals by 2040, and then also net zero goals. And then it also goes through scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And essentially those are our first priorities, is really getting our buildings retrofitted and sustainable. And that would be a scope 1. A scope 2 would be per se like more trees. And so if through the different scopes, it examines first priorities of getting us into sustainability habits. And then scope 3 is what we can not necessarily, we can't build a whole new school that's sustainable within a day. That would be amazing. And so that would be put as a scope 3 as what we can do down the line, or what we are in the process of doing.
Sweet. All right. Actually, are there any more questions for Danny, specifically about the work and the engagement that went into passing the PPS policy? Because then we're going to move on to the next case study. Oh, Linda's wondering about if there are climate-friendly food for school lunches included in the policy.
Yeah, so a majority of public schools don't naturally source their food. And so that was one of the main things that we looked in, because you can have school districts don't serve avocado, but let's just use avocado as an example. You can have an avocado that is shipped over from Mexico, that then goes to Texas, that then goes to Colorado, and then makes a pit stop to Oregon. And so it's really important that we're focusing on naturally sourcing that food, because one, avocados don't grow here, but let's just pretend that they do. We could rather choose an avocado that's locally grown in this false scenario, or we could choose food that is sourced across the country, and which also we have to think about the car emissions that takes. And so really making sure that our food is locally sourced was a priority within the budget and in the policy.
Sweet. Yeah. Okay. I want to redirect us away from avocados. Although, yeah, we can definitely link more information about that policy in the chat if folks want to read up on it more. We are going to get into our next case study, which is Sunrise PDX's Youth versus ODOT campaign. So this campaign started in the spring of 2021, and essentially it was a bi-weekly series of rallies calling for an end to freeway expansion and for the decarbonization of our region's transportation systems. So this sort of contrasts the CCRP example in that this is a more sort of this isn't necessarily tied to a specific policy. It's more focused on building people power for a broader goal. And this campaign was really based around youth and the recognition that our transportation systems are not working for young people, given that we often can't drive, aren't old enough to drive, and also that we're growing up into a future where we need to be decarbonizing things, and adding more car infrastructure is not the way to do that. And our generation is going to be the one to suffer from the pollution and the carbon emissions of continuing to prioritize cars. And so, yeah, this campaign was really successful in building a lot of local political power around the idea of ending freeway expansion. Even though there weren't necessarily tangible policy demands that were met, we really started to change the narrative and the conversation around transportation and climate policy in Oregon in a way that the sort of adult anti-freeway movement that laid the foundation for this work wasn't really able to do. And I think that is something that's important to highlight, is that this fight against the freeway expansions was going on before youth came into it. But the factor of there being young people who are striking outside the ODOT building every other week for over a year, and having the energy and the singing and the just really sense of urgency and passion, that really was what started to shift the meter in terms of the way that our leaders were talking about transportation issues. And so like last year when the election for governor was going on, the candidates were asked on TV, like, hey, there are these youth who are advocating for climate justice and against freeway expansion. Like, what do you think of that? Do you support expanding freeways? And that can feel like a really small moment, but it is a very tangible marker of the way that these things are coming into the mainstream political conversation because of the work that young people have done. Stuff that has been challenging about the campaign, it's really difficult to be taken seriously as young people, as Danny mentioned. I think especially when it comes to these transportation issues, it's really easy for bureaucrats and older generations to look at teenage organizers and be like, oh, like, you don't understand the full complexity of this. You don't understand all of the engineering intricacies. And yeah, maybe we don't have urban planning degrees, but we do know that 40% of our state's emissions come from transportation and that we're living in the middle of a climate crisis. And so expanding car infrastructure isn't the way that we can get the future that we need. Yeah, and then another challenge is just sort of, as mentioned, this really deeply ingrained status quo of needing to build roads, needing to do things the way that things have already been done, and trying to take on that really big entity, that really big social ideology as people who are also balancing schoolwork and trying to live our lives as teenagers, is really difficult. And yeah, it's a lot of work to be taking on at such a young age. Okay, so I want to encourage a little bit of discussion and sharing out what are some things that you notice about these case studies, what stands out to you perhaps about the sort of intergenerational aspect. And then this is also a space, yeah, if you have any other questions for us, feel free to ask them.
And yeah, you can feel free to just speak up if you have a question or an observation.
Thank you so much. This has been great. I really appreciate all of the work that you guys have been doing and your passion around this. And I know it's a lot for kids, you know, to have this on you to take on, to that adults aren't doing a better job of leading the charge on this. I'm curious actually about, and all of this work is great. I've been following it, so impressed by it, but I'm curious. So Senate Bill 854 on the climate education, if you all have thoughts on that, have you been following that? And Danny, maybe that's why you're in Salem, I don't know, but do you have some insights into that Senate education, the climate education bill that's in front of the Senate right now?
So I work in the Oregon legislature around education policy. I just started like 2 weeks ago, switching over from currently worked in the Senate side of the building. Not super familiar, but what I do know is that the Portland policy has been used in many cases as a case study in support of that policy. So I can say with confidence that if it's anything like the Portland policy, I 100% think it would be amazing to implement across our schools. And also noting that I mentioned Portland a lot, and I think that sometimes it's not for the best, only because this work is needed across our state, from rural, suburban to urban. But that again, like we've seen, I've had people from Prineville, Oregon, reach out about how this can be implemented in their communities. I didn't know what Prineville, Oregon was until 4 months ago. So yeah, it's super amazing to see that there is such a push statewide.
Great, thank you.
And I see that Bill has his hand. Bill, please.
There, I have myself, I think, unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Regarding what stands out to me, to me about the studies you've described, one of the things is it raises the question: what clues do you have, or what efforts are being made to involve youth year after year in the program? In other words, in high school, are there some juniors that are involved, and some seniors? And then are there some people who hang on to the Sunrise Movement activities for 2 or 3 years after high school, or has that happened yet?
Yeah, so Sunrise Movement generally is defined as people 35 and under. So like in the Portland hub, for example, we have a pretty good mix of high schoolers and like young adults. I will say, yeah, to the specific point about organizing in schools, that is something that makes it really difficult because, yeah, people are sort of around for a few years and then they graduate and move on. And that makes it really hard to maintain momentum. And so something that we've started doing sort of in the last couple of years is really trying to emphasize training and building up new youth leaders to sort of take on this work after people graduate. So for example, last fall, instead of doing a climate strike, we did a mass climate training where we had like 130 kids from all over the district come together and learn about what the local climate campaigns happening are and how they can get plugged in. And yeah, it's definitely hard. It's sort of a puzzle that we're still working on cracking, especially, yeah, because Danny and I are both seniors. Yeah, and then something else I'll say is like with the multi-generational piece of that, like something that adults can bring is they're often sort of more situated in life and able to show up consistently, which can help sort of bridge the gap with the sort of constant turnover of teenagers. Having more consistent adults around can be really helpful.
As a follow to that, Adah, what do you think? How do you think it would work if the money could be found to have some paid staff for Sunrise in the Portland area?
Yeah, so Sunrise does.
Would that dampen the enthusiasm of the youth if a 22-year-old became staff for the organization?
Yeah, that's definitely something that organizers sort of think about a lot and talk about a lot and try and figure out the best way to make that work. Sunrise at a national level does have a lot of paid staff who sort of carry a lot of this work, though ultimately it is fueled by volunteers. I really believe in paying youth organizers because we are doing a lot of work and spending a lot of time on this when, you know, we could be working other jobs, we could be doing other things. I think that's also an important way to make this movement more accessible, especially to like low income youth or people like who have to be working jobs, making sure that we are getting compensated for the time that we're putting into this. But yeah, there are a lot of the time we lean on partner organizations in Portland that do have paid staff just because they have a lot more capacity. But yeah, it's definitely, I don't really have a conclusive answer. It's sort of a continuous process of trying to figure out the balance of that.
Adah, I'm going to call on, for the sake of time, I'm going to call on Stephen for one last question before we move on. Stephen?
Yeah, yes, I typed this question into the chat box. The question is, how is the Sunrise Movement and your work in schools addressing the impacts of our food system and particularly animal agriculture on the climate, and what young people can do about it? Are they teaching about these impacts? Because they are very, very significant. And generally overlooked?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different aspects of the climate crisis that we need to be talking about. Personally, like my work hasn't focused a lot on those things, but there's
And
definitely
I
always
can,
space to. Yeah, Danny, go ahead.
yeah, and so this was really important to me. One of the things that I really like to connect is the understanding between climate change and colonialism and sustainability practices. A lot of the current day practices that we use didn't exist in the Americas before 1982. So it's really important through the policy process that we were looking at. One, like, how do you connect um, climate change and sustainability in the sense of practices used long ago, indigenous practices and indigenous styles of farming, right? Those have exist. The people live really close with the land and had sustainability practices. On the specific note of agriculture, we're trying to really have the conversations around connecting on sustainability practices of indigenous people before and practices now that we don't no longer use because of colonialism.
So I would like to send you information about this topic because I think it's really important that you know more about it. And I just did a webinar on the food climate relationship that's recorded. It's on YouTube. I would like to send it to you. If you could give me your email address. I put my email address into the chat. I would like to send it to you.
Yeah, feel free to put that in the chat if you'd like, Stephen. I think we should move on now for the sake of time. Adah?
Yeah, all right, we're gonna. Ooh, okay, Danny, go ahead.
Yes, professionalism, as I'm saying this dressed up at the Oregon Capitol. um, so understanding that professionalism is rooted in white supremacy, and this is really important to me because it opens up broader conversations around who is and who is not considered professional. Young people often have to learn to talk like adults in order to be taken seriously, which again sets a standard of who is and who is not taken seriously. Professionalism defeats the purpose of work in activist spaces, as we are here to tear down the status quo, and professionalism upholds it. Young people may appear unprofessional at times. It's good to take a step back if you're uncomfortable and ask yourself why you feel that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so before we move to a quick break before like getting into more discussion, we want to talk more specifically about how we can cultivate adult allyship in the climate movement. We want to emphasize that there's a role in the climate movement for everyone. Like this movement needs artists and speakers and teachers and people who are just like talking to their communities, people who maybe can't show up a lot but can donate financial resources, things like that. And so, yeah, I'm wondering if we could get some volunteers to read off these bullet points. Feel free to just come off mute. Or I can read them.
I'd be happy to read them.
Sweet.
Yeah. So did you just want me to start with the bullet points then?
Yeah, maybe like if we could get one person to read each of them.
Okay. Connect with youth organizers around you and ask how you can support their work. Building relationships is key to sustaining social movements. If you don't think there's advocacy happening around you, you're probably not looking hard enough.
Show up and spread the word about events. Sometimes support can be as simple as holding a sign at a rally or sharing a social media post.
Share knowledge, advice, and experience. We all have something to teach and something to learn. Embrace that.
Start conversations in your circles about intergenerational organizing, cultivate curiosity, and be willing to explore new ideas.
Awesome. All right. We're gonna jump into some discussion around the stuff that we've talked about so far. We have up here 3 sort of guiding questions that you can think about. It's also a great time if you have more questions for us, or if you have questions for fellow participants, to ask those. I've also seen a lot of great stuff coming in on the Jamboard, so if you've seen anything there that you want to bring up, really just want to create an open space. So yeah, anyone can feel free to jump in. I guess let's start specifically with like, what are some of the barriers that we can name to young people and adults collaborating? And then how can we start overcoming those barriers? Any ideas?
If I can lead with a question, Adah, to kind of get things moving, speaking from some experience, I think our culture is just so, for so many years, there's been this sort of there's been this hierarchy of adults over children that's baked into so many aspects of our society, and I feel like we're at this real moment of opportunity to do away with that. But I think that there are a lot of adults who don't have any experience with like trying to approach things in a different way, and they have this natural sort of tendency to think that youth don't know the answers, or youth need to be educated, and that adults don't need to be educated, and things like that. So it seems to me that one of the things that I've learned to do is just really approach things with more curiosity, and just with more like, you know, maybe I don't know the answers. Maybe the youth that I'm working with, like, we can collaborate on the answers. So that seems to be one of those barriers. And I would be interested to hear from you and Danny, because I think it's really interesting I think some adults don't know to ask this, but just even hearing from you and Danny, like, what are some of the things that, like, some of the ways that adults and grown-ups can talk with you, or just like interact with you, that make you feel invited as more of an equal?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things is, I think it's a society thing, but especially I feel like for older people to younger people, is the ability to say the few words of how can I help? Because typically and it's very true in the sense of younger people are asking older people, you know, for knowledge and wisdom, that's needed in our society, but really needed for, you know, sometimes the roles to be reversed, and asking how can I help? What can I do to help? One of the things that is really important is that everyone has a service or skill that can be offered. And I mean that, right? If you can knit, you can do something for your community. If you can cook, you can cook food for your community. If you're a teacher and you can teach, you can do something for your community. If you can babysit kids, which almost everyone can do, you can do something for community. Everyone has a skill. Everyone has an asset to their community. There's no such thing as, oh, I'm not an asset. You are an asset to your community, 100%.
I'll also say, to Kathy's question in the chat, like, what spaces can teens and adults come together? I think that's a really good question, because as Roselle mentioned, our society is very split by age. I think in schools, we've been able to see more collaboration between like youth and teachers and community members, like how Danny talked about with the PPS policy example. There are also a lot of organizations like Sunrise, for example. At our general meetings, there's a good range of like high schoolers and adults. But I think really, like, the main thing I would say to that question is that we need to be creating those spaces, and that they don't necessarily exist yet in the way that we need them to. And so we're always trying to build more coalition spaces across organizations with different ages of people. And I guess something I also want to emphasize is, like, intergenerational organizing doesn't necessarily mean that, like, people of all generations need to be sitting in the same physical room with each other all the time. But if we have a network of these different groups and these different communities, and we recognize all of our connections to each other, and we're sort of in communication about what each of us can bring, that can be really valuable. Because yeah, like, maybe someone who is an adult organizing in their workplace is not going to be able to, come to a meeting that students are having at lunch at their schools. But we can be collectively sort of talking about, how do we all bring our various communities to this climate strike, or to be part of this letter writing campaign, things like that.
Yeah, this is Chuck. First, I appreciate this because it's this first step I've seen in solving the problem that I have, which is I'm waiting for a clear invitation from youth. I'm paranoid about the okay boomer moment, where you step in front of something really good kids are doing, and I don't want to do that, but I do want to provide myself as a resource. So, the simple answer is make clear invitations, make clear requests about what you need.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. I think a lot of adults are cautious about, like, not wanting to sort of step on the toes of the work that's already happening. I would say, like, I really would encourage adults to reach out and say, like, what can I do to help? I think a lot of the time there's really no harm in asking. And if those people want to say, like, hey, like, this is just a youth space and we want you to go do something else instead, that's totally fine. But I think it is important to reach out and not just, like, wait for people to reach out to you. And that's something that, honestly, I think the youth movement needs to work on as well, because we have sort of branded ourselves as, like, the youth climate movement. And I think that has been a barrier to a lot of adults getting involved. And we're trying to change that. And we, need everyone's perspectives in order to make that a space where we can all work together.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about the concept of professionalism. And because that seems to be something that adults are making judgments about, how youth participate or how they even show up. I don't have kids, so I'm not always clued in on the latest jargon or speech patterns. And they can be jarring to me. It's like, wow, that's not like how we talk back in the 50s and the 60s. There's a whole different language back there, which our adults all didn't get either. So what would make you more, what it gets back to kind of inviting, or how can we overcome that? What would help make you feel like you are coming into an environment where you're around adults, say a school board meeting, or down in the legislature, which is can be pretty intimidating to adults. Getting over kind of that hump of, yeah, I'm here and I'm real.
I think it's important to come into those spaces with the understanding that, like, yes, we don't all communicate the same way. And the expectation is not that we're finding some, like, universal way to communicate. It's just sort of seeing everyone with good eyes and trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, and not letting your own sort of preconceived notions about how people should talk, or, like, what it means to be professional, get in the way of really trying to listen to understand what the person is saying. Danny, do you have something to add to that?
There's this really good book called How We Can Win. I'm blanking on the author. But she mentions on collective goals. And she talked about working and organizing in California, and the area she worked in. She organized with a couple of Catholic church, a couple of mosques, some rural community folks, suburban community folks, and some climate organizers, and a reproductive organization. Now you can imagine not all those folks are on the same level on 100% of everything, but collectively, all of them were on the same page about a similar goal for housing. And there was a lot of language that I imagine that group that folks didn't all agree on, didn't all agree politically, didn't, a lot of things. But there's the collective goal, there's the collective reimagining of our world, there's the collective fight for something better. And while there are barriers like that, it's really important to focus on the collective goal for what we're trying to build for our world. Yeah. What was the conversation like for you? And so let's see. Should we just have people talk about? Yeah, can people just either in the chat or out loud talk about how the conversation was?
I'm happy to share. My name's Sarah Gray. I was paired with Nancy Bales, and Nancy and I worked together through our work with the Gray Family Foundation. And then in my professional life, I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I was saying to Nancy that I have 2 simultaneous climate webinars that are happening. I have this one where I'm participating with all of you, and then another one at work where I have the chat kind of going. And so it's really interesting to see the parallels there. But it was great to talk to Nancy about sort of the work that I'm doing personally, just sort of searching for how, because I come to climate change from a very academic space, and which is different than sort of the grassroots, passionate, organizing idea generation that we're talking about here. And so, how do we kind of blend the two, and where are the spaces where, I can make the space to elevate voices of different generations and to bring people together to begin to have these conversations. And there's a Youth Climate Summit happening that one of our friends groups is hosting, I think next month. And so, showing up there and connecting with people and handing out cards. And one of the other things that Nancy and I talked about was about how powerful invitations are to bring people into the space. So, to invite organizers to come to a space to bring their voices into the room, and then also to invite other people into that space who might not otherwise find their way there, to be able to hear those voices and to kind of build that community. And what are the ways that I can do that through, the volunteer and philanthropic work that I do in one sphere, and then also the the government work that I do in the other sphere, and how can you do that? And so yeah, I wrote down a lot of tangible steps. And when we left our breakout room, Nancy and I had our calendars out, and we're trying to find a time to connect further about all kinds of various things. And I'm sure this conversation will be one of those.
So we have just a couple minutes.
Jean and I had a great conversation kind of talking about what we were doing. But for me, I was thinking about some more things I could do locally. And I mentioned to her that as I was driving the other day, I could see there were some kids out in front of City Hall with their signs up about the climate. And I drove by, next time I'll stop and ask them who they are and what they want, and kind of try to engage a little bit more. It's really easy when you can drive by, you can honk your horn and support or whatever. In our town, you never know whether the honk is a for or against. But I think just stopping and taking the time And then the other thing is I've been involved with city. I'm in a smaller town, but it's monitoring the city budget. It's just like Danny said, nobody shows up at school board meetings usually. They're usually pretty tame down here, but nobody ever goes to a budget committee meeting for the city. And yet that's where they're funding stuff like sidewalks, or they're looking about planning for new streets. So it's things like that you don't think about.
Well, I feel like there's never enough time to have these conversations, and it's obviously such a big conversation to have that it's obviously one that we have to stick with. And I'm glad that so thankful that Adah and Danny have brought their perspective and their ideas and their questions to this space and invited us in this way. And I really do want to, you know, I do hope that you all stay with your, you know, stay with the invitation that Adah and Danny have extended in terms of staying in sort of accountability with the person that you've talked with today, if you feel comfortable doing so, because I think that's a great way to do it. And because accountability is such an important part of all of this and recognizing our role in it. And I want to again thank Adah and Danny so much for being here and sharing their voice and their vision with us. And I want to hand things, and thanks again to you all for being here. And I want to hand things back over to Adah and Danny. Thank you.
Okay, cool. This slide, yes.
Homework. What? As me and Adah currently are not doing our homework, we are going to give all the lovely audience their homework. Yes, the students are assigning homework to the adults. Wow. Check in with your break room partner about your commitments to the movement. This doesn't have to necessarily be now. That can be messaging them and talk about what you're going to do over coffee in the next month, or in a couple of weeks. It doesn't have to be immediate, but definitely do check in and have a conversation with someone in your life about what you learned here today. I always think one of the most amazing things is that if you can repeat not always, but if you can repeat what you've learned, typically you've been able to get something into your brain. And brainstorm ways you can work with them and build power to create the intergenerational climate movement we imagine.
Sweet. All right. And then, wait, no, we had one. Okay, yeah. Stay connected. If you're on social media, you can follow us at Portland Climate Strike and Youth versus ODOT. And also Danny's running for school board. So woo! That's a big thing that somehow didn't get mentioned yet. You can follow their campaign account there. We also have a link to donate to Portland Climate Strike. And then also, since we're being multi-generational, if you're not on social media, Portland Climate Strike and Sunrise PDX also have websites that can be linked in the chat. And there should be places to sign up for like email newsletters and ways to keep being connected. And then also there's a climate strike on April 21st. So more information to follow. And yeah, we would love to see y'all there. And there will be updates on those various accounts.